reminder that the church yard sale is moved back to the 19th and 20th. And life groups tomorrow. Sunbury one is going to Perkins. And if you're in the Berwick one, if you don't know, see Frank and Crystal, because I don't know. Oh, yeah. You could probably try to call Brother Frank, but he may not get back to you. It's Denny's? Okay, thank you. Berwick is going to Denny's. All right. So, I want to talk to you a little bit this evening about excuses. I know. Everybody has a lot of excuses all the time. So, we're going to study a couple moments in the life of Moses. And it goes to basically about the calling and equipping of God on our lives. So, let's start out. If you want to turn, if you have a device or a book, to Exodus chapter 4. Start off reading in verse 1. And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice. For they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thine hand? And he said, A rod. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. I'm not fond of snakes either. And the Lord said, And the Lord said unto Moses, Put forth thine hand, and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee. And the Lord said furthermore unto him, Put now thine hand into thy bosom. And when he put his hand into his bosom, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. That's why they say don't eat the snow. You don't know what you're getting. And he said, Put thine hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out of his bosom. And behold, it was turned again as his other flesh. And it came to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, that they will believe the voice of the latter sign. And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these two signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it out upon the dry land, and the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land. Now, I'm sure many of you know the story of Moses and the exodus of Israel. I'm not going to go too far in depth with it, but I am going to give you a little background, just a quick refresher. But the scene actually begins in chapter 3, and it continues in chapter 4, which is where we start. In this moment, God is calling Moses to serve him in a remarkable way. Moses will be God's messenger to Pharaoh, declaring God's intention to remove his people from Egypt. Moses will eventually become the mediator of the old covenant. For now, though, Moses is full of doubt. Not sure why. No one has ever had any doubts. In the course of the chapter, God is going to contend with three distinct issues in Moses' life that use as excuses to serving God. And as we study these excuses, I'm asking you to take the time along this way to consider whether these excuses are present in your own life. The first excuse comes pretty quick in the question Moses poses to God on the mountain in verse 1. What if they don't believe me? Now, something interesting about this. God has told Moses that he will be sent to Egypt to free his people from Pharaoh's grip. And God said that Pharaoh won't listen to. So God is preparing to do miracles against him to compel him to listen. So naturally, Moses' first concern in answering this call of God would be how Moses can convince Pharaoh to listen to him. But that wasn't Moses' first thought. His first thought is, what if the Jewish people don't listen? He was worried that the Jewish people would not recognize Moses' authority and accept him as an appointed deliverer. I thought that was just interesting. I was kind of surprised that Moses didn't raise the problem of the Egyptians first. I think I'd be more concerned about Israel's captors and their ability to thwart the plan that God gave Moses. Instead, his first concern is that God's own people would be an obstacle to answering God's call. In a way, it makes sense. Moses already knows that the Egyptians are going to put up a fight. And God already given Moses a heads up on how the fight is going to go. But Moses is more worried about God's people. To put it in a different way, God, what if no one accepts me as your representative? Isn't that often the way we feel? Moses' doubt in this moment is one that every godly person faces sooner or later in the walk with the Lord. In fact, something up front, God calls men to serve him. And I believe God calls every believing person to serve him fully. Paul says we are to present our bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service. In other words, we aren't saved for ourselves. God didn't save us because heaven wouldn't be heaven without me. Maybe. He saved us to bring glory to himself. And we do that best when we serve him fully with our lives. And therefore, to each man, God will extend a specific calling into ministry. Sadly, though, there are people that think that the calling into a ministry is a profession or a job. Where can I get a good paycheck, which has the largest congregation? Pastors have ministries. Evangelists has ministries. Worship singers. Bible study teachers. They all have ministries. But what about the normal person in church who don't have a calling into a specific ministry? So they're not going to go into ministry? That's not true at all. It's the opposite of truth. In Ephesians, it says he gave some as apostles and some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of service, to the building up the body of Christ. Paul says there are those called into specific spiritual roles within the body, but these leaders then use their gifts and time to prepare everyone else in the body for the work of the ministry. The word for service in the Greek is, forgive me, I might butcher it, diakonia, which means ministry. So any service is ministry. And we're all called to be servants. Ministry is simply serving people in Christ's name. And we're all called to some form of ministry. But when we receive that call, as Moses did, our first thought may not be, well, how will I succeed? Sometimes we think like Moses and turn to God in our hearts and ask, God, who's going to receive me? Will any of your people listen to anything I say? I mean, you all are out there looking at me and hearing what I'm saying, but God, are they actually listening to me, or are they thinking about tomorrow? And will they believe that you sent me to serve in your name? Look how God answered Moses when he asked this question. God did not say, oh, come on now, Moses. Why wouldn't they accept you? You're so smart. You're so good looking. You're made after the likeness of me. You've been trained in the Pharaoh's courts. You're educated. You got it. You went to the best schools, had the best teachers. Of course, people will want to receive you. No, God never said any such thing. God did tell Moses, I will validate your ministry. First, in verse 2, God showed Moses how we could use his staff to perform a miraculous sign. In other words, I will prove your calling in the work of your hands. Then in verse 6, God showed Moses how we could turn his hand leprous and then heal it again. In other words, I will prove your calling in your own body. In the way I make your life become a living sacrifice to me. Finally, in verse 9, God tells Moses how he's going to turn the Nile into blood. In other words, God will validate Moses' authority by calling by the results of his ministry. By the fruit of that calling and its effect on the land. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. And God is fully prepared to validate his call in your life and ministry to ensure we meet his intended purpose. And he will do so by displaying his power in our work, and in our bodies, and in the fruit of our ministry. So we can't point to our lack of qualifications as an excuse for not serving his people. We should respond like the prophet Amos, a sheep herder sent to prophesy against the evil King Jeroboam of the northern kingdom. In Amos 7, it says, Then Amos replied to Amaziah, I am not a prophet, nor am I the son of a prophet, for I am a herdsman in a grove of sycamore figs. He's just a normal person. The next verse says, But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, Go prophesy to my people Israel. So we may not be prophets or apostles or whatever glorified title you can think of. But like Amos, the Lord saved us and setteth on a path to serve in ministry. So what has the Lord called you to do in serving him? But what about lack of ability? Not everyone plays the drums or the keyboard. But certainly that can't be a reason not to serve in some capacity. Moses had concerns about his ability to answer that calling. in verse 10 of chapter 4. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto my servant. But I am slow of speech, and a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb, or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him who thou wilt send. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. And he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in thy mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall do. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. And thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. Moses' hesitation to answer God's call didn't diminish at that point. You know how you talk to somebody and you just keep going on, and you can tell they're starting to get a little irritated? I wonder if Moses felt that by this point. Because every time he says something, God's putting it right back at him. So now his objections move from authority to ability. First, he was concerned that the people wouldn't receive him. Now he's concerned. His concerns turn to the Pharaoh and the possibility that Moses doesn't have the physical skills to be the messenger. And he tells God that if God needs someone to speak to Pharaoh, he should look for someone who is eloquent, someone who can actually do the job. At least he doesn't get an email back that says he's overqualified. Thanks for applying. I've had that before. But anyway, Moses describes himself as slow of speech and slow of tongue. Actually, he says, I'm not a man of speech. I have a heavy mouth. Have you ever heard it taught that maybe Moses stuttered? Or that he has some kind of speech impediment? That may be true, but it doesn't have to be the case. These phrases more accurately describe someone who isn't good at speaking on their feet. Someone who can't form thoughts and words in a difficult situation. Call that a heavy mouth. In other words, Moses is just like you and me. It's just as likely, and perhaps ever more likely, that Moses was simply expressing the concern that we all share. We don't feel confident speaking boldly in difficult situations. What if the President of the United States called you and asked you to lead the delegation negotiating a difficult treaty with Iran? Wouldn't we doubt we had the speaking skills to do that job? Are we eloquent enough? Can we think fast enough to encounter difficult arguments? I think that's Moses' concern. He worries that his abilities aren't up to the immense task God's assigning to him. Well, you know what? Moses is right. His tongue isn't good enough. And he's not smart enough. And he doesn't have enough ability. But the one who made him does. God does. Look at God's response in verse 11. God offers two ways he will make Moses' abilities equal to the task. First, he reminds Moses, who made your mouth? Who gives man power to hear or see? or for that matter, do anything. Is it not the Lord? Our ability to do anything of value for God is always dependent on Him working through us. Not only when we speak to kings, but when we speak quietly to a hurting friend. For He is the one who formed us and gave us life and saved us and directs us. Proverbs 16:9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Secondly, God says, I will raise up others to provide you with the necessary support. You're not in this alone. We have each other. I will give you the words to tell Aaron, and I will be with Aaron as he speaks, and I will get it all done through you. When we consider what God is telling Moses, we can come to one of the most humbling yet empowering truths of Scripture. If we ever hope to do any good work in God's name, it will never be done in our power. It will only be done by God working through us. As a Bible teacher, no matter how much I study, no matter how much I practice or prepare, if I accomplish anything for God, like not standing up here shaking to death while I'm trying to speak to you guys, or sweating through, ring me out when I'm done. If I accomplish anything for Him, it's merely God doing it through me. It wasn't my practice or preparation or my knowledge, although it took all those things to get this done. But if I move, God's going to move. God still demands that I devote myself to the task so that He might mold me for His purposes. The principle is simple. The one God calls, He will equip. And He is equipping Moses to get this job done. How is God equipping you for the ministry that He's called you to perform in His name? Maybe another question is, are you making appropriate use of that equipping? Are you exercising it to bring Him glory? One thing that I learned in the last few years, 10 years maybe, just because you get a call doesn't mean you're automatically going to go through another door and do it. I had to learn that. Just because I started going to ministry classes at another church doesn't mean I'm a preacher. I felt the call, but I had a lot to learn. And I'm still nowhere near where I need to be how many years later. But let's move to the final lesson God will teach Moses in this chapter. Starting in Exodus chapter 4, verse 18. And Moses went and returned to Jethro his father-in-law, and said unto him, Let me go, I pray thee, and return to my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. And Moses took his wife and his sons, and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. And the Lord said unto Moses, When thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all the wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, and he shall not let the people go. Well, isn't that a little disheartening? Go do all this stuff, and, oh, by the way, his heart's hardened, and it's going to be for nothing almost. Well, that would be depressing. Why would you want to go? It's called obedience. Glad he went. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. And it came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, Surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So we let him go. Then she said, A bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. Gotcha. Okay. So I said we'd study about the three issues in Moses' life that served as excuses to serving in ministry according to God's call. The first issue was Moses' doubt that his calling might be accepted by the people. The second issue was Moses' doubts concerning his own ability to answer the call. But now we see a new issue altogether. This is an obedience and devotion to God's call. In verse 19, God tells Moses it's time to depart for Egypt since his adversaries have all died. It's clear to go. And then God let Moses in on part of the plan. God will say to Pharaoh, Release my firstborn Israel. And when Pharaoh doesn't, God will kill his firstborn. God plans to make a point of Pharaoh's disobedience through the life of his son. Then in verse 24, we reach one of the most one second. We reach one of the most I can't even say the word. It's a different verse, different passage. This passage is difficult because of a unique feature of the Hebrew grammar, so forgive me. Hebrew doesn't have pronouns. So the subject or object of the actions are implied in the language and must be determined by the context. In this case, we hear the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. In Hebrew, reads, Lord encountered and sought to take life. We know that Moses was traveling with his wife Zipporah and the two sons. And it appears that at least one of the boys was not circumcised. All Jews were bound by the covenant made with Abraham to circumcise their children on the 8th day. In Genesis it says, This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people, and he's broken my covenant. If someone wasn't circumcised, they were cut off. Another way to translate cut off in the Hebrew is destroyed or killed. So when God confronts Moses, he is angered because Moses has not obeyed this command to circumcise his son. Many say it was Moses who was in danger of being killed. But there are others that say it was his son who was at risk of dying. First, because the penalty of death applied to the one who wasn't circumcised. Secondly, in the earlier verses, God had just finished telling Moses that Pharaoh's lack of obedience would result in the death of his son. And here we find Moses failing to obey God's commandment concerning circumcision. So it seems reasonable that God was ready to bring the child's life to an end because of Moses' disobedience. Then we see Moses' wife react by circumcising the son on the spot and then throwing or touching the skin to someone's feet. Again, with no one name and no pronouns in Hebrew, we're left guessing a little as to what exactly happened. But here is a possibility. Moses' wife Zipporah was not a Jewish woman. Moses met her in Midian. She knew nothing of the practice of circumcision. Perhaps when Moses told the practice after the birth of the child, she didn't really understand it. So she didn't object, and Moses performed the circumcision. But after the first experience, Zipporah has seen enough. She was appalled by it. So she objects to it when the second son comes along. And most troubling, Moses never counters that decision. Here's a man appointed to lead God's nation of people, to represent God to Pharaoh and to the nation of Israel. But it can't lead within his own home on an issue of obedience. Moses should have gone to a man-up trip. He needs to learn that obedience is greater. I think this principle was best reflected in Paul's expectation for leaders in the church in 1 Timothy 3:5. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? Moses had abdicated his responsibility to lead the family spiritually. It resulted in his son's very life becoming a target of God's wrath. I don't want to be at the receiving end. And when Moses and Zipporah sense God's anger, the wife quickly acts to correct the problem, only to show her disgust, it seems, by throwing the skin at Moses. What's more troubling about this whole situation is the way Moses refuses to act, even here to correct his earlier mistake. He seems completely unable and unwilling to take leadership role in his own family, much like he has been reluctant to assume the leadership role God has given him. I believe God brought Moses and his family to this point because it's not enough that Moses just hears the call. It's not enough that he trusts in God's ability to validate that calling. It's not enough that Moses trusts in God to do the hard work in and through him. Though these things are important, they're still not enough. Moses needs to confirm his own life to God's commands and expectations. Moses needed to be obedient in his own life before he could be useful to God in calling other men to obedience. That's like Pastor picking up that Promise Project, pretended that was the beam in his eye, trying to poke everybody else's eye out. He almost succeeded to a couple of them. But consider the irony that had Moses gone to Pharaoh and to the Jewish people and demanded their obedience to God, only for them to learn that Moses had failed to keep the most basic of commandments on that day, circumcision. So where are you when your readiness to serve God in ministry? We all have a calling in a ministry regardless of how we are living. Ministries begin at home with obedience. Whether it's here in Danville, or Bloomsburg, or Berwick, it really doesn't matter what you do, whether it's being a greeter or singing, whatever you can think of. Anything is a ministry. You know, when I first started going to the Williamsport Church, there was this one person that would, every Sunday, whether I played, all right, let me backtrack. If I played the drums, he would definitely come up to me every time and say that sounded great. If I didn't play and I just was a normal person in a chair, he would come up to me and say, "You look nice. Have a great day." It didn't matter. And you know what? After, I think I was there 10 years or more, that's a ministry. Being an encourager, that's, I am not that. I can encourage you, but I almost have to build up for that. I am very much an introvert. I would rather like be in my little corner of a room and not talk to people. But if I prepare and I do what I need to do, God is with me to be here to speak to you. That's the only way I can do this. Otherwise, I'll be home by myself. That's why when I drove truck, I loved it. I was by myself. I could live on the road and be a happy guy. Now I get the best of both worlds with that. But everybody, no matter who you are, older, younger, male or female, whatever, doesn't matter. You can do something. But our ministry, our service to the Lord goes everywhere, not even in the church, which means it goes with to work with us. I tried to talk to the guy who was training me today and a couple of days last week, and he's a Christian, and I use those quotes because you've heard pastors say, when you start talking about God, they come out of the woodwork, "Oh, I'm a Christian," and then all of a sudden, "Oh, you said what?" That's the same kind of thing. And he was telling me all about his church that he hasn't gone to in a year, and nice guy. But I started talking to him about the need for fellowship, and he's like, "Yeah, I don't have time for that." Now, I do have to work weekends, but it's one every 7 weekends. So that's just the way that job is. So I'm not sure why I couldn't go, but that's between him and the Lord. But talked to another lady in Lewistown, my last stop that I delivered to. I've only spoken to her like 3 or 4 times, and she broke down and started crying to me, telling me about her past, and she's a minister's wife, and just was asking for prayer. And so it goes to work with you. It's not just inside 4 walls, which is just a building. We're the church anyway. In school, the kids. I'm glad I am an adult now and not a child in the school system today. I had to deal with certain things I thought was terrible. But this generation's got nothing on that. In the ball field. Won't go into all the ball field. But people cheer more for a home run or a touchdown than they do praising God. But anyway, we all know this. I'm not here to beat a dead horse. And certainly on a mission field, we should be always praying without ceasing. So every time we get to go to the store, we can be sensitive to spirit and try to talk to somebody. And I'm not up here preaching to you guys about that. Me too. But so many men are going nowhere with a calling in ministry because they're held back by the same excuses that Moses erected in his life. But ding, 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 they're all shot down. I just went over it. So no more excuses. So are you hesitating to step out of ministry because you don't know if someone will recognize your calling? Because I've been here for 20 years, someone might say. I've never done anything. So now to come out and say, I want to do this? Well, if God's calling you, yeah. The more help, the easier it is for everybody else. They will recognize God working in you anyway. Are you hesitating because you don't think you can accomplish anything to glorify God? We should do everything for God and not fellow men anyway. God can do a mighty work in a willing servant. And perhaps the toughest question, are you hampered in answering God's call to ministry because you haven't made obedience a priority in your life? Because, you know, we all sin. Everyone makes mistakes. But as long as we're trying and we repent and we try to move forward, I think God will work in your life and be able to give you your ministry. But obedience is key. So, I thank you all for coming and accepting my little talk. Yes. Oh, calendar for May is out there in the fellowship hall. The updated one. So grab one on the way out. It's fixed.